Hello, I'm Elaine Slaughter, the podcast host of the Fabulous Fempreneurship Show. In this special series, we are interviewing the authors of an exciting new book called 8 Qualities of Great Leadership, the critical elements for current and future success. And we're trying to get the in-depth thoughts from our authors on their chapters. So today's guest is Kyle Van Luyn, founder of Elevated Coaching and Consulting in Australia, and author of the chapter on emotional intelligence driving leadership success. And absolutely, that's such an important topic for us to cover today. So welcome to our show, Kylie.
Thanks, Elaine. I'm honoured to be here. Great to chat to you.
Well, it's great to chat with you, and congratulations on just receiving your US visa. I know you've been working on that for almost a year, and it's exciting for you now to be able to travel between Australia and your office in the US and spend some time building your business in the US. That's fantastic.
Super exciting. Super exciting.
So today we're going to talk about your chapter, the emotional intelligence driving leadership success. And we're going to explore the myths and misconceptions about emotional intelligence, because not everybody is familiar with the term emotional intelligence. So perhaps before we get started, you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So prior to launching my company here in Sydney, about 18 months ago, I worked for about the last 13 years or so in senior leadership and executive roles in predominantly the nonprofit space. So I've got a lot of experience and expertise working with people from disadvantaged backgrounds, predominantly people living with a disability, people from refugee backgrounds, women from all backgrounds, women seem to be very disadvantaged, but also working alongside more recently after launching the company with different companies in the private, non-profit sector, but also individuals around that diversity, equity, inclusion, and corporate social responsibility space. So we do a lot with leaders and leadership teams to help them understand what diversity, equity, access and inclusion and workplace psychological safety looks like in practice. And a big part of that is leadership emotional intelligence.
Yes. So I'm excited to explore that with you today. So I think, first of all, it's important for our listeners to understand what is exactly emotional intelligence.
So emotional intelligence, essentially, I guess in a nutshell, is the ability to identify and regulate your own emotions and understand the emotions and emotional responses and behaviours of others. I think in a nutshell, that's what it comes down to. It really starts with self-awareness, having good intuition, being an empathetic leader or colleague or person. Obviously being genuine and authentic as leader if we're talking about emotional intelligence in the context of leadership, but also that ability to show vulnerability. And I think part of that also is being an authentic leader. And emotional intelligence in the leadership realm is that ability to understand what inspires and motivates and makes people tick. What each of your staff members, employees, but also your colleagues might need from you, and how each of them responds to your leadership style. So when we talk about things like creating a psychologically safe workplace, you really can't do that as a leader without a high degree of emotional intelligence.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And if you look at some of the leaders that we have, I don't know about in Australia, but certainly in Canada and the US and in the UK as well, you look at some of the political leaders and you have to shake your head and think that they don't all have very good emotional intelligence. They certainly don't communicate that they do.
Yeah, that's it. And I think something to mention is that leaders with a high degree of emotional intelligence typically are the leaders that really communicate effectively, especially during times of change or disruption. They're the leaders that, you know, people typically kind of idolize and think, well, they have this following. People seem to follow them willingly. Those are the leaders typically that have a high degree of emotional intelligence. They have a high degree of self-awareness, self-management. They typically have very good social skills and social awareness, and they tend to also have very good skills when it comes to relationship management across all parts of their professional and personal lives.
And that's extremely important, because if you're a young person in an organization and you're looking at the leader, you're actually judging the leadership style, thinking, would I do that if I was a leader, or would I not do that if I was a leader? And while you're sort of thinking about that evaluation, you're really doing it for you as a future leader. Like, you're determining your own leadership style from the examples that you see as you go along, like from the time you maybe graduate high school or even before, because you've got leaders in the teaching world, right? And then going through into your, say, mid to late 20s, you're still developing your own leadership style, and you're going to look at those examples. So the more you have of emotionally intelligent leaders to look up to, the better you're going to be as a leader, I think.
Absolutely. And I think when I reflect on my own leadership journey over the past 13, 14 years, I definitely observed those leaders that had an impact on me.
Yeah.
And did that reflection of, well, why did I think they were a better leader than leaders where I either left a company because of the leadership, or the things that I observed happening in that organization at the leadership or executive level. And you're absolutely right. People tend to, especially emerging leaders, they pick the best bits of all of those favorite or effective leaders. I certainly did. I look back and think, okay, well, those 4 or 5 leaders throughout my career that I really looked up to, that were very effective and, you know, fair and equitable and all of those things that you want to be as a leader, they certainly helped shape my leadership style and the things that I continue to do today.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I did the same thing when I was in the corporate world and a lot younger, was pick the style. And sometimes it was a combination of different people. Oh, I really like the way they handled that. And then that could be like an HR issue, or it could be, oh, I really love the way they handle conflict. Like, and that could be a completely different person. You know what I mean? So if you have a few leaders in the corporation, like, you can observe their behaviors and pick the best of how they handled certain things, and then develop your own style from that.
Absolutely. And there's lessons with the poor leadership or the not so great leadership.
Yeah,
You learn
exactly.
what not to do, right? You think, okay, that's something
Totally.
I'd never do to somebody else. I'll absolutely
Exactly.
learn from those sort of situations as well.
Yeah, I had a boss that nobody ever wanted to work with, because the minute you went in his office, he threw up his pencil, he had a fit, and all you've done is go into the office. You haven't even opened your mouth. So most people hated either working for him or going to his office. And I just decided that if he was my boss and I needed to know something, then I had to get over that fear and just wait for this tantrum, as it were, because he definitely had terrible EQ. Once the tantrum was over, then I could talk to him rationally and get the answer I needed. But most people are absolutely terrified of this guy. But I didn't have any choice. I had to find a way to work around him, and you know, I did. But I would never choose him. He never became the head. He never became the president of the court, because he had a terrible EQ. Terrible. So
Oh,
that's the
career
way it
limiting
goes.
behaviors, aren't they? Career limiting behaviors.
Yes, career limiting behavior, that was for sure. So what would you say the number one myth is about emotional intelligence?
I think when it pertains to not just leadership, but business ownership, which is leadership, but just different, I guess, in my opinion, is that it's not as important as other traits.
Right.
That's something. And I think there's that myth or misconception, because even today, and even though emotional intelligence is, in my opinion, the most important thing when it comes to a leader, and something that's difficult to train or learn. You can learn financial management, you can learn human resources. You can't learn emotional intelligence quickly. I don't think it's an
No.
intrinsic attribute.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's that misconception that it's not important because there's not as great awareness. There's not a lot of leaders that are, even those that I talk to, when you talk about EQ or emotional intelligence, they kind of look, the eyes glaze over a
Yeah,
little, and
their eyes
they think
glaze
it's
over and they think it's kind of woo-woo
a
stuff.
bit
And
of that hippie
yes,
stuff, you know?
yes, yes. And I'm a strong guy and I don't need that. All I need is my leadership skills and my IQ and we're all set, right?
Yeah. So that would be probably the number one myth or misconception, is that it's not that important. You can
So,
absolutely get by and be successful and effective as a leader without it.
so the reality is just what you said, that emotional intelligence actually is the most important thing in leadership. It's a big misconception to kind of push it to one side, because the messaging that the leader gives and his demeanor and the way he treats his people as people, or she, whoever the leader is so important to the organization to make it successful.
It's so far reaching that
Mm-hmm.
when I'm speaking with leaders that either don't have the awareness of emotional intelligence or brush it off a little bit, the importance of it, when you map it out for them, just all the touch points within their organization that relates to not only the business's success, so financial, but also you can't have financial success as a business or company if you have staff leaving and you don't have staff retention and employee engagement. And so when you map it out from the very beginning with that talent attraction, how you retain your staff, how you create a diverse, equitable, inclusive workplace, how you create a psychologically safe workplace, which pertains to staff retention, it's all linked to
Oh,
success. And if that
totally.
leader, and I mean, add on as well that overlay of, if they're going through a period of disruption or immense change, if
Yes.
that's not managed correctly and effectively by
Mm-hmm.
somebody who, like you said, is communicating outwardly to the teams regularly, they're communicating effectively, they're using various platforms and forms of communication, they will, it's really difficult to achieve success financially, but also you can't achieve success if all your staff leave because you're a terrible
No,
leader
exactly. I
or
mean,
out of fear.
one of the first things when you're in an interview is finding out subtly what the turnover rate is in staff. Because if
Mm,
there's a high churn rate at a company, that the odds are that the leadership is not very good.
that's right. And I mean,
Because
we
people
were,
leave a job not so much for the paycheck. Yes, they do, if they get a career boost somewhere else, but more because they don't like the work atmosphere. It's toxic, or it's cliquey, or it's psychologically demeaning, or whatever the situation. And so they're going to have health concerns themselves, like the employees that are working in that kind of environment are going to take more time off. They're not going to be engaged in their work. They're just putting in the time, right? They're not really part of a corporation culture that's effective, right?
that's right.
So as you said, EQ, or emotional intelligence, is number one before anything. And I think for our listeners, in this book, 8 Qualities of Great Leadership, there's a chapter by Trevor Stockwell that talks about, the self-awareness of a leader, and that's the beginning chapter, that you need to be self-aware, because that's the sort of, you got to go inwards and do digging on yourself to see how self-aware you are of yourself and your leadership and where you need to improve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's reflective practice as a leader,
Yeah, exactly.
being able to accept feedback and ask for feedback and be open-minded about what feedback you might receive, and then be prepared to not just receive that feedback, but then think, okay, what am I going to do with this now to improve?
Now, it is hard to listen to the feedback. I mean, I've been in that situation as the CEO. It's hard to listen to the feedback on yourself. And I know when we went through 5 dysfunctions of a team training, some of the very senior management staff had a worse time with that than I did. And it's because you don't really think about how other people are viewing you in that way. But honestly, after the whole corporation took that training, it changed the whole culture of the company, because we were much more aware of the importance of emotional intelligence. And it led to a much better cohesive company, because we were, like you said, in one of those reconstructive phases where like 6 divisions were different companies, and then they all became one company, but they had 6 different cultures. And we had to, had cross teams and work together, but we didn't really understand each other because we had different business cultures, because we came from all over the world, right? And so that took some mashing, and that 5 dysfunctions of a team was a great training. It was based on a very popular book, a business book out there, and it certainly led to some changes in thinking about emotional intelligence, for sure. So what would you say the biggest myth is with emotional intelligence?
Sometimes it comes down to that, what I call that learned helplessness. Sometimes you experience that with leaders. Well, everybody does it at some point, but where people, they become aware, so they've kind of got over that first stage. They've got that self-awareness. They might have received some feedback, 360 feedback from their own leaders, feedback from colleagues, whatever that might look like. And then it's at that point where it's take action or do nothing to improve.
Yeah.
And I think the misconception or the myth there is that I can't improve because emotional intelligence isn't something tangible.
Right.
So it's almost, well, I've heard what people have said and the feedback, and I know that there's some things that I need to change to be a more effective, successful leader. But I'm too old, or I'm too inexperienced, or these aren't things, these aren't skills that I can just learn. So that would probably be another one, because it's when we do sort of the training that we do with my company, emotional intelligence sort of it's underpinned in everything we do when it comes to leadership development. But there is that misconception that it can't be learned, and people can't be coached in how to shift their mindset and shift as leaders, learn how to be more effective when it comes to emotional intelligence and tapping in and connecting better with their staff and their teams and their colleagues, when it absolutely can be. It just might be a little bit of a long road.
Yeah, that is exactly it. And the more you practice that, the easier it becomes in the long term. But it isn't like a financial solution or a marketing decision or a sales proposal. It's not going to happen overnight. Like, you've just got to gradually keep working on it.
Yeah. And what we find is that we say that everything starts with the mindset of the individual, whether it's, we're working with a client looking for a job, or we're working with a leadership team or a CEO on how they're approaching a huge disruptive period of change. Regardless of what it is, people have to be in the right mindset. because if they're not in that growth mindset and they're very closed off and sort of sitting in that negative space, they're never going to be truly, and we all sit there from time to time, right? But it's, you know, and if you think about it yourself, when you're in that sort of negative, closed off mindset, you're not open to feedback. You're not, definitely not in a place where you're going to take it on and think, okay, right, I'm really motivated and enthusiastic to make these changes and to do this self-reflection and continue to do it rather than just do it once and then forget about it. It is that lifelong learning as a leader. So I think that people have to absolutely be aware of their mindset and be aware of when they're in the right mindset to then learn those skills and be prepared and open-minded about how they grow as leaders and develop.
Yeah, and be patient too, because as you say, it doesn't happen overnight. You might just see small changes at the beginning because your staff or your team or whoever you're working with won't notice changes right away. They're going to look for a pattern of behavior. So if you just do it once, it's not going to be effective. You got to keep going, right? And keep going so they understand that's part of the new you or the open you that is seriously wanting to change, you know, and it's not just a flash in the pan for flavor of the month, right?
That's it. Because I think if you do things once, and we've both no doubt had leaders like this and people listening, where you think, okay, this person's changing. This is positive. Let's see. And then it just reverts back to poor behaviors again or old behaviors. And you're doing more damage as a leader than good.
Absolutely.
You know, you want sustained behavior change.
Yeah, and it has to be authentic too, don't you think? I mean, this isn't a fake thing that, oh, I got to learn emotional intelligence, so I read a book or I take a course and okay, I'll do exactly what the book says and that's it. It's something that you've got to feel deeply within and it becomes part of your psyche of how you're going to deal with events in the workplace. And not only the workplace, it's in your personal life too, correct? Because
Absolutely.
you need those same skills to deal with your spouse, your children, your pets, whatever, you know, you still need that same skill. So it's a life skill that's worth learning.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
So what would you say the last big misconception or myth is about emotional intelligence?
That's a good one.
Is there anything that jumps out to you that people may not have thought of, or?
People don't know how to, so it's the step before the improvement part that we were just talking about. It's the, how do I find out if I've got good emotional intelligence or not? And I usually say, if you're asking, then there's a good chance. There's a good chance there might be some work to do. But it's people don't, well, leaders, but also emerging leaders as well. We do a lot of work with emerging leaders, and they say, well, how do I know if I've got a high degree of emotional intelligence? They're almost looking for a continuum of where am I sitting compared to maybe my peers, or if they're going through a leadership program internally at work. You know, where am I sitting as far as, am I up the higher end of emotional intelligence, and am I ahead of my peers, my other leadership peers, or not? And so some of the advice that we give is there's so many assessments, online strengths assessments, emotional intelligence assessments, ways that you can find out, as long as you answer, you know, these quizzes and assessments honestly, that you can find out where you're sitting and what your strengths are, but also where there's going to be room for improvement and development. And what are some of the really good ones as well also talk about learned behaviors. So when you think about what your areas of strength are, some of the learned behaviors that might support you to maintain those strengths in your leadership style and the way you lead, but also those learned behaviors might also support you to improve areas where you're not as strong, or you know, strengths that haven't been realized yet, rather than saying weaknesses. We don't like to say weaknesses now, do we?
Develop your strengths
quite often.
aren't quite as strong.
Yeah, that's it. And so it's more that assessment of, well, how do I find out where I'm sitting? And also, who can I ask for help? They're two of probably the big ones before then you move on to the actual improvement and the actual work, which is the working on yourself and improving and learning the skills. And so quite often I say to people, look, there's assessments that you can do with a coach. We do those assessments with some of our clients that are looking in that space as sort of that setting the foundation for where they want to go as leaders and where some of their challenges and pain points are. And that gives you a really good idea of where are people sitting on that continuum when it comes to emotional intelligence. They might be doing some of those components really well. So they might have ticked that box with self-awareness because they're there having that conversation with you as a coach, but they don't feel comfortable yet with the authentic vulnerability that we know comes with people in leadership roles that are operating with a high degree of emotional intelligence. And a lot of men are a little scared to be vulnerable and show who they truly are. Even to talk about, the fact they have children, or, they're married, or they're going to the beach on the weekend. They really have this, this is Bob, and Bob is, this is who I am at work, and this is who I am at home. Where I find that women
bring the human person into work.
Yeah. And then you work with a lot of these men and they sort of go, well, it's too much effort. I'm putting sort of a mask on at work. And then when they say, I'm just going to be myself, they're like, oh, that worked fabulously. I'm connecting with people better. And, my teams are talking to me about, their kids and one of their children are sick and they're opening up more. I'm saying that's because you're opening up more. So it's that reflection, what you put out, you get back.
Yeah. Well, thank you for such a fantastic interview, Kylie. That's great. And people can find you at elevatedconsulting.net. And so again, I'm Elaine Slaughter, and thank you for joining us on the Fabulous Fempreneurship Show. And I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Elevated Consulting website and learn more about the fabulous Kyle Van Luyn, because this has been a really interesting conversation. So I hope everybody has a great day, and thank you for being on our show.
Thanks so much for having me, Elaine. It's been great.